Happy Wednesday morning to you. This is Talking Point Live, coming to you from the campus of Dixie State University and through the auspices of production services of the Community Education Channel. I'm Eric Young, happy to be with you this morning.
I'm Jennifer Kohler, and this show will be airing on November 7th, the day after the midterm elections.
Day after the midterms,
Yep.
wow, yeah.
Yep.
And something that we're not going to be talking about, but we will be talking about
What influences elections?
well, we've already done that for the
Okay.
most part. What I'm trying to wrap my head around is with the recent terror actions that have happened in the United States, with the pipe bombs going out,
Okay.
and with the slaughter of 11 innocent people in a synagogue, and a shooting in a grocery store, and all kinds of things. What I'm disturbed by is the absence of a term in all of these. That term being the concept of terrorism. And this isn't new with this administration. We're on the heels of that with the previous administration as well, where nobody really wanted to call violence in America American on American in terms of terrorism.
You know, I'm glad you're bringing up that, because it would be a good idea. That's a word that gets used a lot, like the word media, and maybe sometimes loses its meaning. Does terrorism then have to be an act like this that has a specific political aim in mind? Is that why it becomes terrorism? Because it's an attempt to persuade or gain political advantage through the use of terror?
Yeah, is it a tag? Does it pull a certain focus to that in terms of rhetoric and how we treat terrorism here in the United States? Or does it fall under an old stereotype in terms of Islamic terrorism?
Right, because I guess what I'm saying is maybe we're not using the word terrorism because in order to use it, this atrocity needs to be perpetrated with a particular political goal in mind,
Well,
as opposed to just general hatred,
so
mass hatred, for example.
Let's
right?
talk about the goal in mind of the shooter at the synagogue at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was pretty clear there was an agenda there.
And what would you say the agenda was?
Well, he made it clear that he was against the Jewish movement to facilitate immigrants coming to the United States. And at that time, we had this rhetoric hitting all the airwaves about the caravan of illegal individuals, and I use that term in hashtags, if you will, who are trying to make their way to the southern border of the United States. At the time, they were stopped at the southern border of Mexico, 1,000 miles away. But here we have the Commander-in-Chief and President of the United States mobilizing 5,200 soldiers to go through and protect our borders from this kind of invasion. So that seems to bubble up into the thinking, at least, of some kind of a political notion that, well, we need to eradicate whatever influence might be out there that would allow these individuals to come into the United States. So would that, by the terms of, or the definition of terrorism, be valid?
I would think if the intention, the motivation for that assault then, say on the Jewish synagogue, was to deter other Jewish organizations from being immigration and refugee
So there's a
supported,
political
right?
agenda there, right?
It sounds to me like there's a political agenda there.
The individual, and I'm not saying their names because I really don't want to repeat their names or give them any more due, but
Right.
the whole agenda of sending pipe bombs out to those who are arguably against the leadership of the country currently, of the Trump administration, would that not be a terrorist act as well?
You know, I am not sure what's going on there. It doesn't seem like a very effective way to silence those particular individuals. It almost seems to create some sympathy for those individuals.
So
I
you're
am not
begging
sure.
the conspiracy theory here that this actually was a left-wing attempt to go through and
I would not go that far.
Oh, good, thank
I would
you.
not go that
all
far.
right, because I would have
But
to
it just seems like an ineffective way
I'd have
to
to mock you
silence people.
on air.
That's what
here.
I'm saying. yeah.
Okay, right, yeah. Very ineffective, especially given obviously that nothing actually ignited. Nothing that went off. There wasn't the other shoe. Fortunately, thank goodness, nobody was hurt.
Is it your understanding there was never an intention for actual physical harm to be created or not?
We don't know, because
Okay.
that information about the incendiary devices hasn't been released.
Okay,
we
we
have
don't
no
know.
idea what their
Okay.
potential lethal threat actually was, and I don't know that we ever will. And I'm not even sure that we need to know. There, I would just like that this whole thing to go away so we can move on to more important things here. But that being said, I've decided to bring back Taylor Grin. He joined us on last week's Talking Point Live in talking about Russian meddling. But Taylor's research for his master's degree focused more on this very concept of terrorism and how this might factor into emboldening alt-right approaches to this. Taylor, thank you for joining us. We appreciate having you back on the show again here.
Hey, thank you for having me back on.
So, would you give us kind of a Cliff Notes version then of your recently, and congratulations, on your research that you've completed for your graduate program there?
Thank you. I'm really glad to be done. So my thesis studied a joint program that's headed by the Department of Homeland Security called the Countering Violent Extremism Program. It started in 2011. And what my research gets into is the degree to which the CVE program might have been made better by better addressing far-right and white supremacist violence. If you look at a government accountability report that was published in early 2017, they found that from just after 9/11 to the very end of 2016, of the 225 casualties that were caused by violent extremism in the U.S. that did not start from some foreign group, 106 of those casualties were caused by far-right or white supremacist violent extremists. That's nearly half. Nearly half of all terror attacks since 9/11 were caused by far-right and white supremacist individuals. And yet, if you look at the vast majority of the Countering Violent Extremism program's efforts by way of research published, funding allotted, entries into the START, which is an anti-terror database, it is almost entirely Islamic terror-oriented content. Which is a problem. It's a disproportionate use of funds and resources is what I ultimately argued in my paper. And to your previous discussion when you were asking what is terror, the legal definition of terror is an act of violence or threat of violence that is performed in order to achieve some sort of political objective. And so if your goal is to create an Islamic state, or if your goal is to create a white ethno state, and you commit violence for either of those ends, that's terrorism. That's the legal definition of terrorism. However, even since the Oklahoma City bombing, people have tended to equate the word terrorism with Islamic terrorism.
Why is it relegated to that narrow definition, do you think?
So I've made a couple of arguments within my thesis. The first one, I think, is a phenomenon called salience bias, which is where people tend to remember the biggest, most vibrant events within a category of events. So in my research, I found that the vast majority of casualties caused by Islamic terror were caused in what are called mass casualty events, which I defined as events that had 3 or more casualties caused, whereas the vast majority of white supremacist and far-right terror attacks involved only 1 or 2 kills. The problem is that there were so many more white supremacist and far-right attacks compared to a far fewer number of far more lethal Islamic terror attacks. The total casualty counts, though, were almost identical. The point I'm making is that because people tend to remember a bigger, flashier event like 9/11, like the Pulse nightclub shooting, they tend to associate Islam with terror because they are more likely to commit those mass casualty events. I also think that there's a certain degree of in-group, out-group biased thinking associated with that. we live in America. There are more white people than there are Islamic people by a lot. And so there's a degree of out-group bias that's looking at Islamic terror where it's something that's not from here. And I think that subconsciously people are less prone to believe that what white supremacists are doing is terror. Instead, they look at it as hate crime, which is a subtly different thing in people's minds.
Yeah, I heard an interesting story about this on NPR yesterday, and they were they were talking about the I'm trying to find the right word here, the popularity of Muslim characters now in mainstream television. And the analysis on that was partly to pull away this whole concept of how the Muslim greeting of God is good or God is great, where we hear that at the beginning of every suicide bomber ready to ignite themselves, instead of in context of people meeting in a coffee shop or the grocery store or something, to go and maybe take that away from the whole stereotyped way of how we see Islam represented within the media. I find that to be fascinating. However, hold on to that thought, because I got one thing for Taylor to come back to you with. And you kind of encapsulated this in indicating that 9/11 certainly went through and eclipsed all of the previous terror that happened. And clearly Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who were responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing. I mean, I remember that happening. I remember watching it unfold live on television. And just being bewildered by something. I think that was really the first event that really rocked us domestically in the United States, and then come to find out, it's a couple of white male Americans going through and doing that. Why didn't that pin stick? And I realize in comparison, and I even hate to even draw a comparison at all, but in terms of the American psyche, of that consciousness, and 9/11, and all the rhetoric that happened from that point on, does that, well, your own research statistics prove that the stereotype doesn't weigh out. And I'm searching for a question here for you, Taylor. And maybe it's one that's hard to answer. Why? Well, why can't we make that shift and go through and recognize at least that we have almost an equal amount of influence happening here domestically in the United States in terms of terrorizing citizens?
I'm of two minds of that. On the one hand, I think that, I want to reflect on a phenomena. In the 1980s, people were afraid of white supremacist gangs, especially. Chicago, LA, Seattle had very dangerous Nazi or fascist punk groups that were fighting in the streets, killing people in the streets. And then those people started to get arrested. So by the 1990s, most people, including law enforcement and the general public, viewed white supremacist gangs as being incompetent. All of their best leadership was being thrown in prison or killed. And so the people who were left behind to lead those groups were radically incompetent at achieving any of their goals. And so by the late 90s, between that and between the sort of early Alex Jones, David Icke type people, far-right individuals and white supremacist individuals became kind of a laughing stock, and I don't think people took them seriously. And now we're seeing a resurgence of that kind of ideology, led by people like Richard Spencer, Mike Cernovich, Gavin McInnes, who are trying to create a more professional, more intelligent-looking white supremacy movement. And I think that may just be cyclical.
Is it cyclical, or are they particularly more emboldened at this point with our current administration?
Well, I think it's both. Back in 2009, a DHS intelligence analyst made a report where he argued that we were likely to, at that point, see a rise in white supremacy and far-right violence. And the arguments he made was that there was a recent economic downturn, a black man as president, and he was looking at things like the Tea Party movement, where, so Jon Stewart had this, the comedian Jon Stewart had this great saying. He said that when you have privilege, other people catching up to you looks like discrimination, if I can butcher a paraphrase of his statement. And I think that that's a lot of what's happening is that every time major civil rights accomplishments occur, or every time there's an economic downturn that affects poorer white men, that it's going to cause, especially those poorer young white men, to lash out and to want to, in their eyes, balance the scales again. Oh gosh, if I can remember his name. So there was a white supremacist like gang leader, Christian Picciolini, recently wrote a book, and one of the things he calls out that those young angry men are looking for is identity, community, and purpose. And if you can get those three things, whether it's from religion or a club or just the people that you hang out with or a violent extremist movement, satisfying those needs, that community, identity, and purpose is kind of necessary to the human psyche.
Well, Taylor,
and if you're lacking,
that's the same draw for ISIS. That's the same recruiting draw for ISIS, exactly. These young men drawn to this identity, purpose, and community.
Yes.
Well, arguably, that's the same draw of many religions as well. We're provided that.
Humans, so we're saying humans need that.
Generally.
If they don't have that from one source, they're going to find it from another source.
Right, they'll pick it up, which, we can go back to Los Angeles gangs and have that same kind of appeal going on there. So
keep going.
Do you have
please.
the rest of that thought, or you?
No, I was probably getting to rambling, but I think that the reason why white supremacy is on the upturn is it's a lot easier to recruit those angry young men over the internet, especially because people like Richard Spencer and Mike Cernovich are deliberately targeting young men who need community, identity, and purpose. And they've said so openly in the media that they're actively looking for those people and trying to provide a place for them to find that and then turn them into violent individuals. Look at the Proud Boys, right? The Proud Boys organization, which is responsible for some violence in New York recently, as well as in Seattle. They're a arguably white supremacist group. They are like developed in a laboratory to provide identity, purpose, and community to its members, to take advantage of those young men who don't feel like they have a place and give them those things and then turn around and weaponize them. If you replaced Proud Boys with some Islamic group and made them headquartered in Syria instead of the Pacific Northwest, we would call them a terrorist organization and we would be throwing money at ending them with bombs.
So Spencer, we kind of witnessed the rise and fall with him, especially with his involvement with Charlottesville and the rioting that happened there, and then the Vice story that happened with him, and then his fall from grace there. But that didn't seem to really hold anything back or taint the movement itself. My question to you is, and much like what we were talking about in terms of Russian influences in the voting process, how responsible is the media here for giving now even more of a voice to a movement like this?
This is one of those rare scenarios where I actually don't think that the media talking about it is going to make it better or worse. The alt-right is prolific online, and every time that one of their nests, if you will, a subreddit or a Discord channel for alt-right members is taken down, another one spawns. I mean, look at as white supremacists were kicked off of Twitter, they started Gab. Now Gab is being taken down by its web hosting services, and they'll probably spin something new up.
So the significance of Gab is it's a social media site, and this is a site that the perpetrator of the massacre at the synagogue was going through and posting and getting information from as well, just to put that in the context so we understand it.
So social media is a form of media, and so you're saying that the mainstream mass media, print and TV and radio, as opposed to social media. So social media is the new home, basically.
Yes, well, and I fundamentally disagree with the idea of a mainstream media or even using the term media as a monolith, because there's no overarching collaboration between, say, Fox, MSNBC, and CNN. They don't get together at a board meeting and say, we're going to cover this. It's all spontaneous, and they tend to converge on stories, but they don't wake up in the morning and say, all of us are going to cover this.
Right.
Social media has just democratized that process even further by giving anyone a mouthpiece if somebody is willing to listen.
Yeah, and we're guilty of using the media
Right.
label to within that monolith without even really
Right,
differentiating.
right. And then, in the previous episode with Taylor, we were talking about Russian influence, but it seems to me now we're talking about American-made propaganda.
Domestic propaganda.
Right,
domestic influences
that
as
has
well.
supported violence. And I was just listening last week on October 31st to a New York Times Daily podcast, and it's called The Business of Internet Outrage, if you want to look up that podcast. But they were interviewing two people that started Mad World, I believe is the name of their outfit, and they're basically in it for the money. I mean, they started it as a hobby, and then they realized they could make money, and then they quit their day jobs and they did it full time, and they realized they could make more money the more incendiary, the more the more polarizing and nasty the headlines, the more money they made.
Yeah, there's an American individual, a former journalist who is perpetuating fake news. He works out of his home in Los Angeles, and he feeds that machine, and he makes about $80,000
Well,
a
isn't
month.
Cernovich is one of those
Right,
people?
yeah, this is
Okay.
another individual who's doing the same thing,
Okay.
but it's all domestic there. as it
So,
goes.
okay, so then the Russians, for the Russians, it's ideology. For the Americans, it seems to be money. Is that,
That's the capitalistic machine
well,
hard to work that way?
I don't know. I think it's a big driver.
Right, well,
Taylor, what's your reaction to that distinction?
I think it depends individual to individual. People like Mike Cernovich, Gavin McInnes, I think that they are more oriented towards, yes, the money. Also, I would throw Milo Yiannopoulos into that category,
Right.
though he's definitely fallen from
Right.
grace as well, so to speak. They're in it for the money. They're also in it for the adulation. I imagine that being considered a thought leader, even if the thoughts that you're leading are terrible, has to have a certain emotional appeal, and that drives those individuals. There are other individuals who I think are true believers. I would say that Richard Spencer is a true believer. He's independently wealthy. His mother inherited a significant amount of money from I kid you not, cotton farm. And so he has millions of dollars. He doesn't need more money. He is a true
perfect is
believer and
that?
wants to spread white supremacist ideology. I also think, and I don't want to get too much into conspiratorial thinking because I'm still developing my case on this, but it's important to know that Richard Spencer is married, currently undergoing a separation, but married to an individual who is the translator for Alexander Dugin. Alexander Dugin is a prominent influence on the Kremlin. He wrote a book called The Foundation of Geopolitics, which helps guide the Kremlin's information operations in the United States. And he's also partially responsible for the 1990s resurgence of Christian and European identitarian movements. That connection is not to be ignored. Especially given that Russia has a history of inflaming white supremacist and other racist ideology issues within the U.S. Without kind of double dipping as far as the content we've discussed, I think it's intellectually dishonest to ignore that link.
no, there's no such thing as 7 degrees of separation anymore. Maybe there still is with Kevin Bacon, but not within these circles as far as influence goes. So what would you, or maybe what have you, I still need to read, I need you to forward your study to me, but what would you recommend to Homeland Security or those individuals who are responsible for some level of security when it comes to this idea of domestic versus Islamic terrorism?
Sure. I think the low-hanging fruit is increased funding for groups like Life After Hate. They were actually removed from the group or from the list of funded groups for the CVE program after President Trump took office. They were slated to get funding, and then they were removed from that list. Groups like that help rehabilitate individuals who are getting out of white supremacist and far-right movements, they need to get more funding. I think in general, the DHS and other intelligence and law enforcement communities need to check their own inherent biases and be willing to do more research on the far right and white supremacists. The problem is that, like that researcher I was talking about in 2009, sometimes the lashback from the political right is so bad that it shuts those people down. When the individual published the report in 2009 about the increasing risk of white supremacist violence and far-right violence, he was attacked so stridently by individuals on the right, up to and including then Minority Leader Boehner, that his department was shuttered. It was reduced from 12 people to 3, and he left the DHS within 2 years. George Salem, the former head of the Countering Violent Extremism program, never once in the entire time he worked for that task force mentioned far-right and white supremacist issues. As soon as he left his job and joined the Anti-Defamation League, he started talking about it. So individuals in those government agencies need to ride out the political blowback of covering white supremacy and far-right issues and publish the reports anyway.
So wait a minute. What I'm hearing you say is that even given this balance of terrorism and of individuals affected by it, we're seeing a more of a diminished approach to going through and eradicating this, or at least going through and subverting it on some level. Am I hearing you right?
Yes. Presently, it is on the decline, not the increase. The CVE programs addressing of white supremacy issues. Now, I think as citizens as well, what we should be pushing is more interaction. I was having a discussion the other day where I think that one of the best possible things we could do is starting at the K through 12 level, some sort of sister school program that allows students to interact with people from a very different background of themselves. Get people from an inner city talking to people in a very rural, like say Appalachian region, and vice versa. As Mark Twain said, and again I'll butcher a paraphrase, travel is the enemy of bigotry, right? Or the antidote for it. So next best thing, let's use social media. Let's get people from different regions talking to people from different regions so that they're not strangers anymore.
So I've seen a little bit of this fringe kind of manifest here, even on our campus. And my attempt to engage there is a critical thinking approach in terms of becoming more provisional, getting away from your default attitudes. But when somebody has a tenet that is strongly held based on a hatred, that's even more difficult to go through and root out. How do you deal with that emotional response of actually hating somebody and trying to turn that mind around?
Let me pipe in on that, because I'm remembering an intercept. I'm remembering a podcast where this journalist was covering that Berkeley, when they had the Antifa people at this Berkeley demonstrations a couple of summers ago, and the hater was attacked by the Antifa people and beaten down to the ground, and the journalist jumped on top of the white supremacist to protect him from possibly being killed by the Antifa people. And what happened is there was love by interposing himself physically to save the hater. The black journalist demonstrated love and caring. And what happened is it broke down the hatred of the white hater. It's I hate to say that, but it has to do, hate can be conquered by love.
Right. Well, it's also the antithesis of fear, which is what's driving both Antifa and the alt-right inclinations to get people radicalized.
I think it was Al Letson who was the journalist that then interposed himself to save this well-known white supremacist hater.
Okay, all right.
And then Al had him on his show later.
I remember seeing that.
And the fellow was moved and touched by the sacrifice and the apparent physical harm the other fellow was. So I just want to put a plug in there for that.
What do you think, Taylor's lovely answer?
Oh, absolutely.
You got 30 seconds.
In the mid 2000s. Oh, Okay. Yes, I agree.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yes,
I
and
didn't mean
I've
to
seen it
curtail you
happen in my
at
own
that
life.
point, but yeah, you've been watching Talking Point Live. We've been joined by Taylor Gren, who's a former student of Dixie State University. He's gone on to complete his master's work in intelligence studies from the American Military University and is in information operations and domestic extremism. Taylor, thank you for joining us here on Talking Point Live. I'm always inspired by you and by your brain. It's amazing. I think it's incredible with what you're doing. For Talking Point Live, I'm Eric Young. I'm here with Jennifer Kohler. We'll see you next week. There we go. Thanks for joining us.